Hi, this is Scott Wilkinson, host of Home Theater Geeks. In episode 168, I chat with Dolby Senior Vice President Ioan Allen about all the audio technologies that Dolby has developed over the last 40 years. So stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust. This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Home Theater Geeks is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Home Theater Geeks with Scott Wilkinson, recorded July 29th, 2013. Episode 168, 40 Years of Dolby. This episode of Home Theater Geeks is brought to you by ProXPN. ProXPN is a virtual private network that allows you to use the internet the way it should be, anonymous and unfiltered. For 20% off your new account, go to proxpn.com/twit and use the promo code HTG. Hey there, Scott Wilkinson here, the Home Theater Geek and Director of Content at avsforum.com. This week's guest geek is Ioan Allen, Senior Vice President at Dolby, with lots of information about Dolby Labs and their participation in professional cinema for the last 40 years plus. Hey, Ioan, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Scott. Nice to be here.
So nice to have you with us. Those who are tuned in live at live.twit.tv or logged into the chat room at irc.twit.tv can post questions for Ioan, and I'll pass along as many as I can. Now, Ioan, you joined Dolby, if I'm not mistaken, in 1969, right?
Can you believe that? Yes, indeed. 1969.
That's quite amazing, actually. And you've seen, obviously, in that time, the movie industry go through some serious changes. What, in your opinion, are the most important of those changes that you've seen?
Are you talking about picture or sound or
either, any,
or,
whatever?
Or
you've been
scripts.
Involved more with sound, right?
How about the scripts?
Well, okay. I mean, sure, whatever you want to talk about.
Let's say back in 1969, almost every movie was only available in mono in most theaters, and very restricted bandwidth, which went from about 150 hertz to 3 kilohertz. So it's little better than a phone line, and that's what people were used to. And if you think about it, what we've got to today is an all-encompassing, fully immersive experience with an excellent bandwidth and pretty stable, good quality acoustics. So things have got a lot better, and it's been a long, steady path of progression, a series of steps, each one elevating the quality, getting closer to the point where both in terms of picture and sound, you almost feel that you could reach out and touch the actors, something that was not possible back in the early 70s, late 60s.
Well, certainly that's true, although I'm reminded of the comments that people made way back when, in the very early days of cinema, the early 1900s, where audiences would go into a theater and see a train coming towards them and duck and claim that it was indistinguishable from reality, which, of course, today we would laugh at. But I guess it also, there's also the development of perception in the audience, right?
Yeah, I think that story about the Lumiere brothers and the train coming into the station in Paris, I think that's apocryphal, frankly.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, but there is no doubt that we're getting closer to reality, and each step, people don't realize how good the next step could be. And in audio terms, I've seen adverts for wind-up gramophones from the 1920s, which said, "At last, the sound of reality." And let's not kid ourselves. A wind-up gramophone with a 78 RPM record and a single loudspeaker and a horn that was kind of like a toilet roll is not going to sound like reality. But the copywriters felt they could claim it was. Now, I think you might think that in terms of audio media, let's not get into movies and cinema for a second, But in terms of the improvement on audio media over the last 10, 15, 20 years, things are getting asymptotic to being closer to reality. You know, there were huge jumps back in the 50s and 60s. We went to stereo, we went to the 33 RPM record. All those things were magnificent, major jumps forward. And I think to the average consumer, the jumps forward in recent years have not been of the same kind of quantum magnitude. Something like that.
So by asymptotic, you mean we're getting closer and closer to indistinguishable from reality, but each jump may be a little smaller than the one previously?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it takes the more and more skilled audience. Now, your audience is presumably very well attuned to minor changes, but I'm talking about the general public would recognize the change from mono to stereo. Wow, listen to that. You know, the trumpets are on the left and the strings are on the right, and Frank Sinatra's in the middle. But the general public on today's changes may not notice the quantum shift. It takes a more and more skilled audience to detect the improvements.
And certainly, in a way, we've seen almost a backslide with MP3 and its popularity. So many people listening to highly compressed audio and calling it fine.
There's a trade-off always between expediency and speed and simplicity of transmission and the quality. And that's become more apparent of late, where people are fighting for bandwidth and fighting for speed of downloads. And, you know, I suppose there may be a rebound from that as we get more into quality. Codec development still goes on, you know, and it's interesting. Do you improve the codec to get more capacity and a better audible quality, or you improve the codec to get it there faster and use less bandwidth?
Yeah, we're certainly seeing that in video codecs with H.264, for example, being used now, and H.265 coming down the pike for this UHD or 4K content, which is said to be 50% more efficient. And I wonder what we're seeing in the way of audio codecs. And obviously Dolby's been at the forefront and deeply involved in audio codecs, in compressing audio and coding audio for professional movies as well as home cinema and so on. Give us a sense from your perspective of the progression of audio codecs, at least from Dolby.
You know, it's what I was saying. You have to draw a balance between quality and speed and bandwidth demand. As a good example of that was when we introduced digital sound on 35mm film back in 1992, when there is a limited amount of area on the film, and you have to say, this is the bit rate we could tolerate, how much compression do we need, and how much robustness do you need in terms of bit damage, and you finish up with a bit size, which is dictated to you by those parameters. So that's how we introduced 5.1 was introduced on film. But the decision about how much compression to use and how rugged the bits should be was dictated by the space available on the film and the typical abuse that a piece of 35mm film would get in the movie theater.
Which was pretty serious. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I am a big advocate of digital projection, because it doesn't use film and it stays the same in the 100th or 1,000th or 10,000th viewing as it does in the first, which you can't say about film.
Yeah, you're talking obviously about digital files being projected.
Right.
I was talking about digital sound on 35mm.
On 35mm film, right? Yeah. Exactly. But the same question applies, which is if you've got a digital soundtrack on 35mm film, which was represented optically somehow, and maybe you can help me understand exactly how that was done. But by the time the film has run through the projector, has the quality of the sound degraded as along with the quality of the image?
No, the thing about digital sound on film was it would go on forever until it suddenly stopped completely. The thing about analog sound on film was that it would decay steadily with scratches. You'd hear crackles and pops and stuff like that.
I see.
But
Okay.
the digital medium was perfect until it's not there at all. Don't get misled, though, that even though you're absolutely right about the visual quality, theoretically, from digital cinema is significantly better than the visual quality on 35 millimeter film when the print has been run through the mill and it's got scratches and dirt on it.
Yeah.
But the fact is, on day one, it's probably still pretty comparable, the quality of digital cinema and 35 millimeter film. At day 1000, the digital cinema file will definitely look better, with one caveat, which is that it takes more light to project digital cinema files. So
Really?
you have to make sure that the cinema is pumping the right size of lamp into that lamp house and is keeping the current up, because many a theater in the old days of 35 millimeter film would run the lamp until it was dim. And the danger is they'll do the same thing on digital cinema files, whereupon the improvement you get from that length of life is kind of thrown away.
So I'm curious to know if you know the answer to this. Why is it that digital files need more light than film?
It's the size of the imaging inside the projector. You know the size of a 35 millimeter film frame, and the digital imaging elements mean that you finish up needing more light.
I had never thought of that before. That's great.
And also, I think there is an issue relating to how the cathodes are assembled in the xenon lamp. Because the answer to all these things are in the future, which is the prospect of laser projection, which is always just around the corner, but it's possible that within the next 12 months, you'll see some commercially available laser projectors when there is a lot more light available. And that's going to help not only the theaters from being able to maintain a good quality of light, but it will also help those situations where 3D, for instance, which requires more light than 2D images, will get its fair share.
Yeah, I had Don Shaw from Christie on a couple weeks ago, and he was talking exactly about this subject, laser illumination, and how I actually got to see it here in my hometown of Burbank. They had a laser projector installed for a couple of weeks as an experiment in a commercial public cinema just to check it out. And it was pretty impressive, I have to say.
The day will come when you have to wear dark glasses when you go for an outside movie.
Well, Wex5 in the chat room is asking about where you see movies going in the future in terms of sound, which I'm going to ask you a little later. So just put that off to the side, but that is certainly a question that I do want to ask. In fact, several people are asking about that, so we'll get to that shortly. But first, I wanted to take a little bit of more of a historical perspective. And you mentioned to me off the show, off the air, as it were, how professional developments, and Dolby's been involved in both the professional world and the consumer world, lead to consumer improvements. And you gave me a couple of examples of that, and I'd love for you to expound a little bit on that particular subject.
Our raison d'etre when the company was new was noise reduction, taking the hiss out. And that was one of the major elements in the ability to go over to multi-track music tape recording back in the late 60s and early 70s. And the 16-track tape recorder was abominably hissy. And it was Dolby A-type professional noise reduction that made the 16-track a really good quality medium. And it was that adoption of A-type that stimulated the music industry into wanting to better quality on the home cassette. And what made that possible was Dolby B-type, the consumer system, which became ubiquitous on the hi-fi cassette machine. Anybody remember the cassette?
I do. I'm old enough to remember the cassette, yes.
And the cassette, well aligned, was a really elegant and good-sounding product. And it possibly wasn't as good as the master tape that it was derived from, but it would certainly stand up to good scrutiny alongside the 33 1/3 RPM record. And in fact, I would say that at the time of the introduction of the CD, a well-recorded cassette sounded better than the CD, where the early D2As were really bad quality on the early cassettes, on the early CDs.
On the early
nowadays,
CDs.
Of course, nowadays, of course, the CD players are far, far superior to what was around then.
Mm-hmm.
But the crux of the story was that it was probably Dolby A-type that led to Dolby B-type. And I refer to it as the engine that pulls the train.
Mm.
And you can say the same thing happened after some years as we went from Dolby Stereo in the movie theater to Dolby Surround on early VHS tapes in the home.
Dolby Stereo was what was used in the commercial cinema, and Dolby Surround what was used in the VHS tapes.
Yeah. And, within all these mediums, there are steady improvements. We went from Dolby A-type in 1986 in the music business. We moved on to Dolby SR, which is a really high-quality analog recording system for professional music, which was later adopted in the movie theater on movie soundtracks. These things always run in progression. You could say that Dolby Digital on film, which is the first thing to use the Dolby AC3 process, which is data compression and with digital audio data, that led to the audio system we're used to today on the DVD.
Dolby Digital.
Yeah.
I'd love to get a sense, if you can, explain how Dolby noise reduction worked.
Dolby analog noise reduction is analog data compression, any way you look at it. And you can't do this. Can you describe a spiral staircase without using your hands? It's very difficult to describe noise reduction as a technical process without starting to do diagrams and stuff like that on a blackboard. But in principle, what it was, both A-type and B-type noise reduction were an encode-decode symmetrical system. And on the encoding side, low-level signals would get boosted up, high-level signals would get left alone. In playback on the decode side, high-level signals would get left alone again, and low-level signals would get suppressed. But the decoder cannot tell the difference between wanted audio and the hiss that's coming from the tape. So the hiss would get removed, but the audio was being restored to its original state. For those of you of a mathematical persuasion, you could say that X plus delta X is what's coming out of the encoder, and the decoder takes X plus delta X and subtracts delta X, and you finish up with X. So you get noise reduction. The music or audio program is perfectly restored, but the hiss has been reduced.
I think I understand. Your low-level signal might include some quiet musical passages, but it also includes noise, and that all gets enhanced or amplified.
Not the noise. No, the noise is not being enhanced. The noise, of course, is in playback only. It's generated on the tape. The encoder is getting the encoder gets the clean signal with no noise added. It just takes the low-level components and raises them.
Got it. And then at the decode side, all the low-level stuff, including the noise, gets reduced.
Yes, but the decode stuff, the music, has now been restored to the way it was when you originally recorded it, but the hiss has been taken out in the process.
Yeah.
So the important thing is to realize it's an encode-decode symmetrical system. And this is true of all the analog professional Dolby noise reduction and consumer noise reduction from us. And if you think about it, the philosophical, if you like, parallel is the same thing with a codec. You take a signal and you encode it. You then record it or transmit it, and then in playback, you decode it again. So it's the same symmetry in digital. It's the parallel of what we used to do with analog.
What about Dolby Stereo and Dolby Surround? Is that a symmetrical encode-decode cycle as well?
Same thing, yeah. If you remember the Dolby logo, the double D logo?
Sure.
That double D logo represented encode and decode.
Interesting. I never knew that.
So, yes, the film program has always depended upon encode and decode, symmetry again. So the early films like Star Wars and Close Encounters, the audio program of 4 channels in those days, left, center, right, and surround, would get encoded onto the 2 tracks on the film, left total and right total, And then in the cinema, they would be decoded again back to the original LCRS. So in a sense, the spatial characteristics are being compressed in the way that the audio is compressed in terms of noise reduction, and then decoded back to restore the original content.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Gotcha. Yes, it does. It does, in fact. Interesting. Web 9842 in the chat room says, "What's a CD?"
Whoa.
We've even gone beyond that now.
Yeah.
And I do. I meant to mention. I remember when CD first came out, it was advertised as perfect sound forever.
Yeah,
And
right.
I found that very interesting for you to say that a well-recorded cassette with Dolby B actually.
I should have said with Dolby C, which is a later emulation. Yeah, B-type, you'd still hear some hiss on the cassette, but C, the hiss was essentially missing, and that was an ultimate quality for the cassette which could be compared with the CD very favorably, with the early CD.
Right. Nowadays, of course, not so. But I wonder, here's an interesting question just occurred to me. I wonder about comparing an old cassette with Dolby C type noise reduction compared to MP3.
Oh, I would rate the C type cassette as better quality any day. Because there are no coding artifacts.
Right, exactly.
I'm not putting down MP3 in terms of its efficiency, in terms of its latent saving of bandwidth. It's very successful in that standpoint. But that is the balance the designers of MP3 chose to select in terms of how much bandwidth, how much compression do we need, what quality we're prepared to get. And that's always true of any codec design, that you have to say, you have to compare somehow or other the quality you want versus the bits you are prepared to use.
Beatmaster in the chat room is asking, what's your favorite movie in terms of, in regards to surround sound?
Which 3,000 movies do I want to upset?
Well, you're representing Dolby here, so maybe you can't answer that question, but.
I talk about the quality of sound a lot in terms of the film director doesn't want the audience running out of the theater saying, "Oh, the sound, my God, the sound." And he doesn't want the audience running out saying, "Oh, my God, look at the quality of the picture." He wants you to come out of that movie theater saying, "What a great movie. I'll encourage my friends to go to that movie." And this means probably an integration between sound and picture where you don't, on the soundtrack, constantly say, "Whoa, listen to that surround effect." The thing has to be better integrated than to have that kind of standing out. So from a surround point of view, you don't necessarily want people to say, "Oh, the surrounds were terrific on that." I want people to feel that integrated experience. I'm sure we're going to talk in a minute about Dolby Atmos, which is our latest immersive sound format. And I just want people to say, "What a great movie."
You want the sound system, if you will, to sort of disappear.
Absolutely. And you want the picture
to not draw attention to itself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Now, it may be that the sound designer and your audience who really get into what's in there much more than just the overall experience may say, "Hey, the sound was good for this reason, for that reason. There wasn't any distortion. The levels were correct, et cetera, et cetera." But for the average moviegoer, what the industry needs is for them to enjoy the movie. Let's not talk about the quality of the scripts. We could get to that if you like, but it's what you have to make sure is you have to make sure the technology doesn't let down the value of the movie. Excuse me.
Yep. Yeah, I understand completely. And yet there are some movies that the movie director, content creator, producers, whoever, decided to put more or less in the surrounds, who maybe mixed it into in some really good way. Are there any movies in particular that stand out for you as being especially well done in this regard?
I'll take you back in a history story again. Back in 1977, we did the first Star Wars, which was one of the earliest films to use a Dolby stereo release. And that was followed quickly by Close Encounters. And they're two science fiction movies with a lot of surround content. Excuse me. Sorry.
No problem. I believe me, I understand that all too well.
Yeah. I was frightened that we would get tainted with the brush about Dolby encoding was something you'd only use on a loud science fiction type movie. But luckily, we got Terry Malick to do Days of Heaven using a Dolby encoded soundtrack. I think that's 1978, which is the first subtle use of surrounds, fields of waving corn. And it was a mind blower to a lot of people in the industry as to how, without loud rocket ships in the surround tracks, it was effective enough to totally draw you into the story. You know, the sound of a tinkling stream. Here I'm getting a glass of water. Sorry.
No, that's quite all right. Believe me, I've been suffering from this horrible upper respiratory infection that has been going around, and I've been coughing up a storm for the last month. So, unfortunately, I feel it when you cough. I feel it in my own chest. So, yeah, I understand altogether. Please continue.
So the excitement of Days of Heaven was that for the first time ever, people were using the surrounds in a subtle way to help make the audience participants in the story. I used the word very strangely. I used the word about voyeur, which is what happens when you look at a 10-inch TV set with a mono loudspeaker. You're outside the story looking in. The art of what we're involved with in technology in terms of good use of surround, good quality projection on the screen, the image is right, the sound is right. It makes you a participant in the story instead of just a voyeur. And that was one of the things that Days of Heaven did for us with that subtle use of surround, showing off just what can be done with a soundtrack, as opposed to just an effects track on the surrounds.
Right. I've noticed a similar thing in multi-track or multi-channel music recordings, where in the early days, the surround channels were used rather blatantly and, in fact, called attention to themselves. I remember an early Eagles release where the cowbell kept, coming at me from the right surround, and I kept turning around and going, "Stop that cowbell!" Not like we need more cowbell. But more recently, people like Mark Waldrop and Bill Schnee have been doing more subtle, immersive surround mixes. And I think that's analog or parallel to what you're saying here, that with experience, movie directors and sound mixers and so on have learned to make the surround system much more cohesive, much more immersive, if you will, to the point like Days of Heaven, as you were talking about, where it's just an enhancement, bringing you into the experience more.
Yeah, I lecture quite often to film students and at film festivals and stuff like that, and to film directors. And one of the guidelines I always try to give them is to start out, before you shoot the movie, with a sound storyboard. You're probably all familiar with the concept of a storyboard for the picture.
Sure.
But I think sound storyboard alongside that is such a useful feature, because it can tell you what sound effects you're actually going to need in terms of telling the story. And it also will say things like, this would be a good space where you need the sound of a field of waving corn. Because one of the problems we have is frequently that the value of the sound of the field of waving corn is not realized until post-production. And there's a great deal that can be shot on location. It's what's called wild track. And those sound effects, if recorded in stereo, or better still, in real 4 channels, when the movie is being created, will have such a reality when you come to put them into a composite mix, without being ostentatious in any way. It just makes the whole experience more real.
Right. Gotcha. Well, we got a lot more to talk about. And if you'll stand by for just a moment, I would like to take this moment to thank our sponsor for this episode, which is ProXPN. Now, ProXPN is a global VPN, or virtual private network, that works with almost any internet connection. It creates a secure, encrypted tunnel through which all of your online data passes back and forth. Any online application can work with ProXPN, including your web browser, email, file sharing, and instant messaging programs. ProXPN keeps everything you do online hidden from prying eyes. Very important in these days of government spying regulations, or revelations, I should say. It disguises your physical location, gives you an unfettered access to any website or online service, no matter where you live or travel to. Now, it provides many, many very useful features, including complete online privacy through a 512-bit encryption tunnel, works via OpenVPN or PPTP, your choice, lets you protect yourself against your ISP's 6 strikes rule, and it keeps your personal internet usage private at work. Very important. It bypasses internet filtering and blocked websites, bypasses geographical restrictions. ProXPN makes your internet connection region-free, in fact. The software is available for Windows and Macs, and it offers advanced controls, allowing you to select the programs and ports you want to anonymously route through ProXPN's servers. ProXPN also works with your iOS and Android device, allowing you to use your data plan or public corporate Wi-Fi with complete and total privacy on the go. No app required. You get world-class customer support, and Steve Gibson, right here on the Twit Network, gave it a great review on Security Now. Go to proxpn.com/twit for more information and to sign up. ProXPN premium accounts are normally $9.95 a month or $74.95 for an entire year, but we've got a special offer. Use the promo code HTG to receive 20% off for the lifetime of your account. That's less than $5 a month on the yearly plan. If you're not satisfied, you can cancel within 7 days for a full refund. So go to proxpn.com/twit and sign up with the promo code HTG. And we thank ProXPN very much for their support of Home Theater Geeks and the entire Twit network. So Ioan Allen, Senior Vice President at Dolby Labs, has seen it all when it comes to movie sound in the last 40-plus years that he's been working at Dolby. We've been talking a lot about compression and multi-channel. Now, of course, we have Dolby Atmos, and I wanted to spend a goodly amount of time on Dolby Atmos, which I'm a big fan of. We have one Dolby Atmos theater here in Burbank, and whenever I can, whenever there is a movie release that has been mixed in Dolby Atmos, I go to see it. In fact, tomorrow night, I'm probably going to go see Wolverine in that theater because, as I understand it, it was mixed in Dolby Atmos. Ioan, give us a sense of what it is, how it came to be, how it moves the needle of movie sound forward.
Let's start out by saying that, more channels is a good idea in theory. There are certain limitations, as I'll talk about in a minute. The amount of data you can get on 35mm film was restricted by the real estate and the size of the bits. But one of the excitements about going to a file system, a digital system, is that in theory you can have limitless amount of data. Obviously there's some constraints about distribution, but it means you have the capability of going beyond 5.1, beyond 6.1. Our first step on digital files was to introduce the concept of Dolby 7.1, which, as most of you know, is left, center, right, left and right sidewall, left and right rear, and the subwoofer. And that was, an improvement on 6.1, an improvement on 5.1, but they're pretty, if I put dBs onto it, I'd say they're equal 2 dB improvements. But we were looking for more like a 6 dB improvement. And started talking, those are emotional dBs, not actually measurable.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're not talking about audio dBs here. You're talking about emotional decibels. I like that.
So
In
we
other
did
words,
a lot of,
would it just for an aside here, would an increase of 3 dB mean it's twice as emotionally impactful?
it's difficult to quantify, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
So we did a lot of surveys amongst filmmakers, mixers, sound designers, and film directors, and asked them what they wanted to see in the next generation soundtrack format. And what we discovered was that there was certain benefit to the idea of jumping away from the channel concept of movie theater sound. If you think about what 5.1 meant, 5.1 meant in a cinema, not necessarily in the home, but in a cinema, there'd be an array of loudspeakers down the left and back walls, an array of loudspeakers on the right and back walls. All those speakers would be paralleled up and addressed with one signal, which meant it's a somewhat smeared signal because of the time of arrival. So somebody sits in the middle of the audience, the sound from that half left speaker comes first, the sound from the front left surround speaker comes last, and the same thing about the left rear loudspeaker. So that smeared arrival time makes for a kind of smeared directionality. So there was a general feeling that those channel-based systems have a benefit for things like the field of waving corn, the tinkling stream, the sound of wind in the trees. There's also a great benefit to an object-based system, which could address each loudspeaker individually. So the heart of Dolby Atmos, which I think is unique, is a combination of channel-based sound and specific object-based sound. This means that we can take a sound, let's say your tinkling bell that you were talking about earlier, and make it come from a specific speaker in the sidewall of the auditorium. And in fact, what Dolby Atmos is, it goes further than just having sound in the sidewall, because we have specific directionally aimed, or could be aimed individually, loudspeakers in the ceiling. So if you like to think of it, you're putting the cinema audience into the base of a hemisphere where you can direct a sound to any point in three-dimensional space around the audience and above them. And in addition, you have the capability of the old channel-based format of laying in sounds that come from multiple loudspeakers to generate an atmosphere, field of waving corn, as I talked about. Now, this sounds like it's, for want of a better word, it's wham bam, and it's not. This system is not uniquely aimed at a movie with lots of sound effects in that hemisphere, because the benefit can come in all kinds of ways. Not only this three-dimensional mapping capability, but also the fact that you can run atmospheres more sophisticatedly than you could before. You can extend the width of music, for instance, because the music can now come from a wider sound source up front than just left and right and left, center, right, because you can go out to extend it into the front left surrounds. It also, indirectly, because we're very strict on specifications of what goes into a Dolby Atmos equipped theater, we can say that the sound is overall cleaner because we're making sure that there is enough power that the right loudspeakers are being used. Of course, we don't make loudspeakers, we don't make power amps, but we do have the ability with Dolby Atmos of specifying the quality of the loudspeakers and power amps that should be used. And we work with different manufacturers to ensure that they have things available that will live up to our specs. So I think you'll find that with the Dolby Atmos presentation, not only is it enveloping, but it sounds cleaner. The distortion is lower. You'll find it easier to understand the words. It's altogether the next step in the experience for cinema sound.
How many theaters currently are equipped with Dolby Atmos? Do you have a number on that?
Yeah, we're just over 200, I think, which is
Worldwide?
around 100 in the U.S.
100 in the
in
U.S.
fact, it's interesting that out of those 100 theaters in the U.S., we got 80 of them were just playing Wolverine this weekend. So that was pretty good for Wolverine.
Yeah,
I'd like to tell you that Dolby Atmos helped the box office.
Well, it'd be interesting to know if that were true. Strengths in the chat room is asking, when can we expect Dolby Atmos theaters in Australia?
Actually, I think there is one. Is there not in Sydney? If you go to the Dolby website, you will find a list of all the the Atmos theaters. It's probably out of date by about 6 weeks. These things are normally out of date, but that will give you a pretty good line of which territories have Atmos capability.
Mm-hmm. And also on the Dolby website, I would want to point out is a list of all the movies that have been mixed in Dolby Atmos.
We've now got to 60 announced and released movies, which is a faster rate of movie acquisition than we had anticipated. You know, the first movie that was released was Brave from Disney last year. Mm-hmm. And the growth since then has been startlingly quick. And also the interesting thing is that it's so international. You know, we have Dolby Atmos mixes coming from numerous countries around the world.
I wanted to ask you about Atmos mixes. I got into a little slight argument on AVS Forum about whether or not Brave was the first Atmos movie or Oblivion. And the distinction that was made in that argument was, well, Brave was first mixed in 5.1 or 7.1, I forget which, and then remixed in Atmos, whereas Oblivion was mixed first in Atmos and then folded down to 7.1. Is that a worthwhile distinction to make?
Yeah, we use the phrase native mix.
Yeah.
Brave was done as a 5.1, 7.1 first, and then the stems were made into a separate Atmos, Dolby Atmos mix. That's a pretty expensive way to do it because it means you're going to spend, I don't know, I'm totally guessing, 2 weeks extra in the mix room, and that's an expensive hobby.
Call it a hobby, yeah.
Yeah. Oblivion was the first film to do a native Atmos mix, which means the mix is done in Atmos and then can be automatically rendered down to generate a 5.1 and a 7.1. And that's going to be increasingly become the trend. I mean, the reason for doing it the reverse way around on movies like Brave was that Atmos was new and fresh. The mixers wanted to be sure it behaved properly. As soon as they developed that confidence, then the native Atmos mix became a possibility. Mm-hmm. And that is the future.
Yeah. Am I also correct that Dolby Atmos is scalable? That is, if one movie theater has 45 speakers and another movie theater has 40 or 35 or some other number, the processor and the whole system can adapt to that and still take the sound-emitting objects like an airplane or whatever and still steer them around as needed and adapt to different size systems.
Absolutely. You know, in the way I said that you are mapping, if you like, inside a three-dimensional space. And so imagine that any sound is simply addressed on the file as an XYZ coordinate system. And then when you get to the theater, the Dolby processor that takes that data has been mapped to know where the loudspeakers are in that particular theater and how many speakers there are, and will then send the sound to the correct loudspeaker for the playback in that particular environment. So we can handle up to 64 different output directions speakers in the cinema with a single processor. So, you know, that way you can simply adjust the number of speakers to suit the playback environment, and the processor takes care of the rest.
Mm-hmm. Cabo Zone,
neat, eh?
It's very neat. Oh, yeah, believe me, it really is. And in fact, Cabo Zone asked this question: how does mixing in Atmos translate down to 7.1 or 5.1? How does that, you mentioned earlier that it was an automatic process. How does that work?
So let's take the horizontal plane first. It's easy enough to visualize how best to take all those horizontal elements and where to put them into the 7 available channels, you know, the 4 surround channels, which is the best direction. Is it a combination of these 2 channels, or everything into the left wall, everything into the right wall? And it will simply work out where best to put the elements. And the same thing applies to the ceiling sound channels. You know, if you imagine, supposing you had a sound that's right above your head in the Dolby Atmos version, you might want to determine to put a low-level equivalent to that on all 4 surround channels to give you the same surrounding element as where best to put it. And in experience so far, the mixers have been very happy with the rendered down mixed version. I don't like the word down mixed; it always sounds a little bit crude. But taking the Dolby Atmos signal and rendering it down to a 7.1 or 5.1 version.
Mm-hmm. Best case scenario in the chat room is asking, what is the minimum requirement, pardon me, for a cinema to be certified as an Atmos theater?
You'll find on the Dolby website some pretty sophisticated specs about power handling and the direction as to where the loudspeakers are. Power handling is slightly more rigorous than we've recommended in the past because potentially the level from any one individual surround speaker can be much higher than it was asked to do before in an array-based system. And we also mandate that speakers in certain positions in the theater, like very front left side wall, are there when previously they weren't necessary. And every Atmos theater, the design and equipment has to be approved by Dolby as part of the installation package. We have to sign off on every theater. Now, it may be that in 5 years' time we'll relax some of those regulations, but it's very important to us that in these early days, every Atmos theater is a testament to how good things really can sound. Because if you're honest about it, that there are 120,000 theaters in this world, maybe 80,000 of them have some kind of Dolby processor, some of them dating back to the days of analog, and not every theater sounds as good as some of them do.
Right. We were talking with Don Shaw a couple weeks ago. I mentioned that earlier. And I forget the number he said, but the level of transition, the rate of transition from film-based to digital-based in the commercial cinema is very fast. So I would imagine that that would also include a transition from Dolby analog processors, as you mentioned, to Dolby digital processors, and may not be that far behind to install Atmos, other than the fact that it requires a bunch more speakers. Well, maybe not a bunch. They've got a bunch of speakers along the sidewall, probably, and back wall. All they need to do is install some on the ceiling.
And front and left surround. But the speed of transition in this case is the transition from analog 35mm film to digital file-based systems. And that has been triggered by the studios deciding not to support 35mm film anymore. So there's been this artificial time pressure on the theaters to convert to a digital cinema projection system. Now, converting to a digital cinema projection system still requires then going through the steps I talked about of checkout before they can install an Atmos processor. And to be fair, I should point out that the Dolby processor for Dolby Atmos is, in some theaters, will be a fairly small percentage of the installation cost, where it will be the cost of rigging speakers in the ceiling, the cost of buying proper power handling equipment, and the cost of new power amps.
Mm-hmm. I'm looking back in the chat room. I can't find it exactly. Someone asked about the difference between Dolby Atmos and ambisonics, which I don't think they're analogous. Ambisonics is a way of capturing three-dimensional sound. Is it also a way of reproducing it?
There wasn't a reproduction system for ambisonics, but I think of it mainly as you say, as a capture system. So you can capture with ambisonic microphone system and transfer that quite conveniently into Dolby Atmos, I would think.
Yeah, I would think so too. Okay, well, the one question that several people have asked in the chat room that I was going to ask anyway, do you envision Dolby Atmos migrating into home systems anytime soon?
Well, I'd like to think we're going to get firmly established in the cinema business before that happens.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you were prematurely, if somebody were to introduce some kind of immersive system into the home, it doesn't help the cinema business. And the cinema business, I believe, is the heart of what ultimately becomes the consumer media business. You know, it is the next Hunger Games in the movie theater is what's going to lead to Hunger Games into in the consumer field. You know, you have to keep the cinema going because that's how new movies are marketed. Mm-hmm. The promotion comes in the cinema on the marquee. Now, if there were to be an Atmos system in the home, Dolby Atmos in the home, I would guess it'd be somewhat different because I know my wife would be reluctant to let me start pumping loudspeakers into the ceiling of the living room. And I can assure you it's not going to be this month anyway, whatever it is.
Yeah, right. No, I understand that. And as you've said elsewhere during our conversation, the professional world leads the way. It's pulling the train, as you said. And eventually the consumer world follows. But there is the spousal acceptance factor in how many speakers will your wife or husband, in a few rare cases, allow to be put in the room, unless you have a dedicated room, unless you're lucky enough to have a dedicated room. Well, this leads to the question that I did want to ask you also. We have a few minutes left. You mentioned to me offline that you had a few things to say about what's wrong with home theater today.
I think it's akin to what I was nudging towards. It's akin to somebody who says, the surrounds are really exciting on this movie. I think there's a great danger, or used to be, with people with new home theaters who didn't have the proper setup skills, that they'd be tempted to crank up the surrounds and crank up the subwoofer, then invite their neighbors around to come and hear how loud the subwoofer sounded. Isn't that great? And they're not really helping the presentation of the movie. They're getting away from this concept of, I love the story. And that's an unfortunate thing. Maybe after a few months they get over that and start setting things up correctly. But if you read the manual and then play the setup discs, you used to find that people would be tempted naturally to really show off. I remember in the early days of Dolby Stereo, in a movie theater, a manager would say, "Is the stereo working?" And he'd stick his ear into a surround loudspeaker, not being prepared to accept the fact that stereo actually went left-right. He would actually think, by principle, I'm paying for surround loudspeakers, I want to hear surrounds.
Well, that brings up actually another question that I had regarding commercial cinemas and home theaters too, for that matter. One of the complaints that I have about commercial cinema presentation is the volume. Now, I've actually gone in with a very sophisticated sound level meter and measured movies that are presented, and they usually are just barely scratching the edge of an average level over the entire movie of 85 decibels A-weighted, which is something around the OSHA standard. Although, correct me if I'm wrong, but commercial cinemas actually measure sound levels in C weighting. Is that correct?
They'll set up using C weighting, yeah.
Yeah, and C weighting gives more emphasis to the low frequencies, the bass frequencies, which certainly in most modern movies, I'm sure in Wolverine, are very pronounced. I mean, your pants flap sometimes at some of those frequencies.
Yeah.
What do you think?
C weighting is used for setup. It is not used for measuring the level of an entire movie, for which you need something like an LEQ program, which is an averaging program.
Right, which is what I use.
We use a weighting like M weighting, which is what we use for measuring the level of trailers and under some circumstances for a whole movie. But I'd suggest to you that the reason many movies sound too loud is probably because they're pretty distorted in the movie theater, probably because of an under-specification and a lack of maintenance in that movie theater. If you go to a mixed room in Hollywood and they play a movie at the correct fader setting, which is fader 7, or go to a first-run theater in New York, or go to somebody's screening room, it's very rare, it happens, but it's pretty rare for somebody to say that movie is too loud. But if you go to some suburban theater, which is mass-produced and hasn't really been maintained and was under-spec'd anyway, I bet you your first reaction is to say it's too loud. Your second reaction will be that the audience, somebody will complain to the projectionist.
Right.
The projectionist then turns down the fader. And the net result is, of course, that the dialogue will then disappear and the music and the effects will sound much louder than the dialogue, which you can't quite hear. Then somebody else will run out saying it's much too loud, the music and the effects are deafening. In actual fact, because they're playing it too low, that it actually subjectively makes the movie sound too loud. It's a real paradox. Are movies getting louder over the years? Yes, I think they are. Are they too loud? Occasionally, yes. We put this into perspective. The level of a movie is way below a football game in a stadium, and it's way below a rock concert. Can you do yourself harm with a movie played at proper levels? If you listen solid for a week, 24 hours a day to that movie, you probably be on the road to possibly causing harm in the long run. But for the normal person, comes off the street, goes into a 2-hour movie, he won't do himself any harm.
Okay, I understand.
Did I answer that question?
Yeah, no, you did. You did. I myself, at my age, I want to protect what hearing I have left, so I do, in fact, wear earplugs in movie theaters, and I have a set of custom, really nice, flat ones, so I can still hear the dialogue, and that's totally fine. I do object sometimes when I go to a movie, even one of these animated movies, and somebody brings their infant in there, and I'm measuring 85 dBA, and I'm just going, oh man, infant is in for some tinnitus later in life, but maybe not.
Yeah, maybe and maybe not. I'm inclined to think not. And in 10 years' time, that infant is going to be wanting to see the next Batman movie played even louder.
Well, then, and as you say, movies maybe are getting louder and louder, and this is perhaps an unavoidable trend because, if somebody goes to a movie and it's very impactful and very loud, they want that again the next time, and so they're going to be mixed that way. But as you say,
I don't think there's a quantum leap here. I think I can find you a movie today that's obviously louder than some movie from 20 years ago. But is it a whole quantum leap? I don't think so. A film like Apocalypse Now was pretty loud. The Right Stuff was loud. I don't think we're miles louder than those movies are.
And as you said earlier, Dolby Atmos, for example, is designed to distort less and may very well appear perceptibly to not be as loud because there's less distortion.
Absolutely. We're back on the issue about where is the film? The film is in the story. What makes the story work? Good technology. Good technology means low distortion, good bandwidth, good clarity, good spatial coherence. All those technical elements that can help tell the story.
Yeah, exactly right. Best case scenario is in the chat room is saying, there's not a single Atmos theater here in Northern Ireland. Please ask Ioan to make a phone call.
I'll get on the phone. Give me your number and I'll send you one.
All right. Very good. Very good. Oh, by the way, speaking of which, Web, I think 9842, if I can find it, just apparently is an installer and has, in fact, installed 2 Dolby Atmos theaters in homes in Bel Air. Now, we will assume that those are mansions, possibly owned by film people who could afford to put a Dolby Atmos system in their home theater. That's not a typical situation, but apparently, it can be done.
But they've got hands on DCPs, the digital cinema package from the Hollywood studios.
Exactly, because you're not going to get a Dolby Atmos soundtrack in any other way.
And these were the homes where they used to get 35mm films, I'm sure.
Right. Exactly. Well, for the last question, then, let me ask you, can you tell us what's next from Dolby? I mean, Dolby keeps coming out with very interesting stuff. I didn't ask you much about the consumer products, such as Dolby Headphone, Dolby Virtual Speaker, Dolby Volume, because you're more involved in the professional or the commercial cinema side of things. But I wonder if there's anything you can tell us about what to expect from Dolby.
I think my answer to that is keep looking at the website. There's always something around the corner, and I'm not the person to suddenly say, "Hey, here's the new big consumer thing." But just watch the website, and you'll find early introductions of new activities, both professional and consumer.
Well, there's certainly plenty to look at there at the website, including one of my bookmarks in my web browser is the list of movies coming out mixed in Dolby Atmos. Because when a movie is in Dolby Atmos, that will be my first choice to go see it that way. Because I do find great value in the directionality, in the sense of envelopment, in the sense of immersion in the story, which, as you said, is really the bottom line. It's, can you lose yourself in the story? And certainly having the sound in a hemisphere around you helps greatly with that.
You said it exactly right.
McT in the chat room is asking, just a flashback question, was Dolby involved in Sense-Around?
No, not directly.
No, that wasn't yours. Okay.
That was a universal system used on Earthquake and Tora, 2 or 3 movies.
Yeah,
and it was a very binary, low-frequency rumble system. We came up with a system shortly around that time, which we facetiously called Baby Boom, which tried to extend the low-frequency response smoothly without having the kind of binary on and off rumble effects that were required for Dolby for universal Sense-Around. The thing about Sense-Around was it was ideal for an Earthquake movie, but I doubt you could use it for a more broadly based content movie.
Sure. Certainly not Days of Heaven.
Absolutely not.
Okay, very good. Well, Ioan Allen, thank you so much for being with us. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I appreciate your time very much.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you.
You can learn all about Dolby. We've been talking about it all day here at Dolby.com. You can find me, of course, at avsforum.com. You can email me at scott@twit.tv. And you can follow me on Twitter at htgeekscott and also at avsforum. You can also find previous episodes of Home Theater Geeks right here on twit.tv/htg and on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/twit-home-theater-geeks. Next week, my guest geek is scheduled to be Andrew Jones from Pioneer, the world-renowned speaker designer, who's going to be talking about the new soundbar coming out at the end of August. So I do hope you will join me for that. Until then, geek out.